Hi everyone, so I'm Monique. Thank you for coming to my talk today. Bit of a content warning before we begin. I make mention of victimization, poor mental health, and suicide in this talk, and I appreciate that this is a difficult topic for many people, so it's important to be kind to yourself during and after the talk, and it's okay to step back from it and rejoin. And it sounds cliche, but doing something good afterwards can be good. Just like look at or do anything that just helps you recenter yourself. Bit about me. I'm an autism academic focusing on autism, minority stress, mental health, and autistic community connectedness. I'm currently a research fellow at the University of Stirling. Before this, I did my MSc and my PhD at the University of Surrey. And prior to this, I spent 4 years working with autistic children, young people, and their families as a social care practitioner. And I got my BA in social care practice at the same time from AIT in Ireland. And talks basically a reflection on my work, looking at minority stress as a model to understand poor mental health in the autistic community, and whether autistic community connectedness would buffer the relationship between minority stress and poor mental health. So why this research? Well, that's really easy. Autistic people are more likely to have poor mental health, including depression and anxiety, and there's a high rate of suicide in our community. Um, and one of the things that frustrated me to no end was that in psychology, it's almost treated as received wisdom that poor mental health is inevitable in the autistic community, and a result of autism itself. But there isn't actually that much to back up that argument. So why minority stress? Well, it posits that decreased social standing and status result in an increased stress burden, which results in health inequalities. And also that decreased social standing confers fewer social resources with which to handle this increased stress burden. And basically, I did it because I want to contextualize autistic mental health within the context of the social processes and systems that shape our lives. Psychology has a habit of putting autistic people under the magnifying glass and really focusing on our feelings and emotions, thinking processes, personalities and traits, and our behaviors without necessarily considering what's happening in our homes and families, at schools or work, within communities, with regards to healthcare access, norms and expectations, and social and cultural values. And that's something that I really wanted to do, is to put autistic people in that context and see how that relates to poor mental health. Um, but throughout my PhD, I had a lot of feelings of discontent. Um, I didn't want to objectify autistic people. God, that happens too much in autism research. And by only studying trauma, sometimes we can perpetuate this idea that, being all of being autistic is inherently negative. And it's just not. Um, Two, I really struggled with the fact that psychology is not transparent about meta theory, and that makes it feels like a house of cards because no one's being honest. Three, the literature is so dehumanizing, it's actually a little bit soul crushing. And when they describe autism in these terms, they're also describing me. Four, people are saying that these accounts are more objective or scientific just because there's distance. That feels wrong. Five, it's getting increasingly lonely doing this whole science thing. Um, I spend a lot of time defending my position. Six, I'm really just looking for a philosophy of science that supports qual and quant psychology and also having values because I have them. I'm autistic and I want something better for our future. And seven, how on earth, amongst all of this, do I foster agency as a researcher for me or my participants? So, one, we're more than our trauma, and the problem is that I spent many years looking at the effect of various kinds of trauma on mental health. So, looking at things like victimization, everyday discrimination, expectation of rejection, the process of disclosure and outness that autistic people always balance between, the effect of concealing autism on mental health, and also actually one of the worst is internalized stigma, and it's the process of internalizing all of these negative ideas that you hear about autism until the point where you sort of believe them, or you endorse them, or you struggle with them. And the reason that I wanted to study autistic community connectedness is that it's not an individualistic resource. The idea of individual resilience can look a lot like victim blaming, because it is in some ways. Um, yeah, you shouldn't have to become more individually resilient because you shouldn't be facing minority stress in the first place. Um, Whereas autistic community connectedness can capture the way autistic people build solidarity with each other and how that might be helpful. And it also addresses the good things in people's lives, which often is other autistic people and the sort of collective mastery that autistic people build with each other. So psychology is not transparent. So paradigms provide the boundaries for the researcher's ethics and values actions in the social world, the control of the study, like who initiates the work and asks the questions, and the voices deployed in accounts of research, and indeed the very basic fundamental understandings of the world the researcher is investigating. And it's most of psychology is predicated on the idea of the view from nowhere. And that's the idea that if you use the scientific method to try establish causality, that the product of knowledge production stands alone from the scientists, completely unbound from cultural and social values. And psychology's idea of objectivity is based on the idea that if we use experiments and numbers, that we will be distant enough from the object that it will stand outside of us. And that's the idea of knowledge being objective. Objectivity thus becomes detachment from the object. It is a metaphorical distance in between you and what you are studying. And psychology has been predicated for a very long time on the idea that if psychologists use the scientific method, that we will produce objective data. And yet, value freedom is idealistic, but no one ever tells us how it's achieved, ever. There's this idea that if you just do the scientific method, that science will be produced at the end, reliable science. But actually, the interpretation of data is an action, and everyone is pretending that data speaks for itself, but it doesn't. And you see this in autism research, where even when autistic people outperform non-autistic people, it's taken as evidence of deficit, right? So there's some real like mental gymnastics going on there. But everyone's pretending that just doing science is enough. Psychologists alter their data to their own ends all the time. So you see this where psychologists remove outliers, for example, or inconvenient data, where they're not transparent about who they've removed or why they've removed data. There's lots of issues around things like p hacking. And also, psychology has had a strong history of racism, homophobia, ableism, cisgenderism, transphobia, and sexism, to name but a few value based problems. And all of those problems are underpinned by values, right? And all of this means that it results in what's called a methodology, where we think that just doing the method of science is enough to make something objective, which is why psychology is now focused so heavily on things like replication, when in actuality, some of that's not going to be fixed because it's issues that go beyond just employing a specific method. The literature is so dehumanizing. So this actually comes from a paper that I published recently, where I go through examples of this. We're described as economic burdens, incapable of having moral selves, or personhood, or community, inherently selfish and egocentric, equivalent integrity to that of non-human animals, that we lack the ability to inspire the minds of others, are subhuman and in need of rebuilding, and exhibit less marked domesticated traits than non-autistic people, and extensive arguments supporting the use of eugenic programs have been published. with exceptions being made for those who are deemed economically productive or normative enough not to make other people uncomfortable. I won't lie, I was crushed by a lot of this sort of literature, especially when I was a master's student. I spent a lot of time feeling angry and alone. And then the idea that we lack epistemic authorability or the ability to create knowledge on what it means to be autistic. I spend a lot of time wondering if objectivity is distance from the object, then I will never be objective, right? Because I am the object. And there's a quote that sums this up so well. I am autistic and writing on autism. There are no contradictions here, and yet I feel compelled to get defensive. Autism discourse and I are co-constituted. And I've never read anything during my PhD that I felt as closely as that quote actually. And it was because autism research then is coping with how other people in the field are busy constructing people like me. And they'll be very quick to say, oh no, not you, other autistic people. But I am inescapable from that because they are talking about me. They just think that they're not, but they're creating an idea of autism that also reverberates into my life. Um, yeah, and then also dealing with the idea that they're meant to be, or the structures that we have within science support their claims to objectivity, while also claiming that autistic people who try to create knowledge are somehow more biased. So basically, and this is more open and honest than I've been about the process, but autism research when you're autistic for me was it was lonely. I spent a lot of time feeling humiliated and degraded and objectified, but I didn't feel like I could speak about it because I had to appreciate being let into the club, so to speak, of other autism researchers. It's also wondering if positivism or this idea of scientific objectivity is right when those ideas are so dehumanizing. Are they more objective or scientific? And also feeling like I had no real agency because I had to work within the idea of psychology that we have built and the idea that you can just employ the scientific method and create something that is objective or outside of you. Um, I felt like I had to be working within this positivistic framework, and it felt wrong most of the time. And I spent a lot of time thinking, what would be better than this? And also, why aren't non autistic autism researchers querying their position as much as I am? Because I feel like I'm doing a lot of mental and emotional work that other people don't have to do. And that was something that I really struggled with. And I think my supervisors and colleagues and people kept asking why I was focusing so much on the theoretical stuff when I was doing an empirical PhD, but actually it's because I was constantly caught in this doubt and this loneliness and this dehumanization, and I was trying to make a view of the world that could encompass all of these things without these claims necessarily constituting me, if that makes sense. One of the problems in psychology is that this idea of objectivity, value freedom, and employing that if you employ the scientific method, that you will create something scientific, is that it results in methodolatry, right? And methodolatry is the idea that if you just commit yourself to the method enough, that the rest of the science will fall into place and it will be reliable because it's made up of numbers. But this idea steals agency. Why? Because it forces people to work within certain methods, regardless of whether or not they're actually correct for the context. So, for example, I experienced pressure to only interview people one way to retain like method validity, even though that would exclude autistic people, for example, who were non-speaking. Only include diagnosed people, right? Because that will make peer review easier and to retain the validity of the sample. And even though we know that, lots of autistic people, especially minorities, don't have access or, necessarily want a diagnosis or whatever, we really need to rely on the diagnostician being the expert on this. So only include people who are diagnosed. Which I was wildly uncomfortable with and did say no, but I experienced pressure because that would retain some of that methodological validity. Prioritize methods that are tried, tested, and trustworthy, even if they're not necessarily fully appropriate, because there is a way to do things, right? And there's just this subtle messaging that you need to work within this normative framework of psychology. And also separate yourself from your work, be detached. No values here, thank you very much. Leave that activism stuff at the door because that doesn't belong in, science. Um, you know, Pressure to not disclose being autistic because they might think that you're biased, and we wouldn't want that, right? So, as well as just leaving your values over there, thank you very much, just shut down that conversation. And that's how methodology stole my agency. And honestly, I felt trapped because I felt like I needed to do things a certain way to have legitimacy, even though it was just feeding into the constructions of autism that have arrived us to this mess in the first place. For me, the answer was critical realism and community psychology for developing agency. Under critical realism, while there is one reality, there are multiple interpretations of that reality which are socially, culturally, and historically situated, which means that autism can be a very, very real biological thing and still be socially and culturally constructed. It is both of these things. It does not conflate the measurement of reality with reality, which means that accounts of reality are still contextual and may be more or less accurate. And there is a place for both qualitative and quantitative research because you're trying to measure real phenomenon, but you're also looking to the experience of it. And I'm very excited for Marianthi's talk on critical realism because it's just really great and everyone should be a critical realist. With community psychology, it's this transformative, value based practice that aims to address social injustice and inequality. And it's underpinned by social justice and equity because it ultimately aims for the liberation of humans, which means that you don't need to separate out your roles as researcher, activist, practitioner, and you're meant to engage both at universities and amongst communities, and community psychology gave me an avenue to being both. What did this change for me? Well, you need transparency, accountability, responsibility, and constant reflexivity under critical realism and community psychology. It means taking ownership of your work and the consequences of your work, which means that not just qualitative work, theoretical work, empirical work, quantitative, no matter what it is, you're meant to constantly engage in reflexivity about how your own values inform what is happening, and also take ownership of the process and the end product and what that research and knowledge does in the world. Under critical realism, you realize that dehumanizing accounts of autism are shrouded in culture and social situations of values which are imposed on autism through value-loaded language. They're inseparable from the scientists and the researchers who create them, and they are a representation of an underlying reality rather than a reality. And also, this means that distance does not equal objectivity. Everyone has a position, and our understanding of an underlying reality is filtered through these values, right? Which meant that actually it's their take on reality, but that doesn't mean that it's a good take or the right take. And that actually helped me feel a lot better. So, how does this relate to agency? I started discussing my own positions and values. Throughout my entire thesis, I used I language. Passive language would suggest that I wasn't a part of the science, and I am. It gave me room to acknowledge and reaffirm that my work is underpinned by social justice. I 100% believe and aim to work for a better future for autistic people because they deserve that. We deserve that. I'm open about my research process because I know that transparency is the key here. Things went wrong, I wasn't perfect, and I try not to pretend to be. Um, and there's actually a level of transparency there that um, some researchers kind of balk at because they're kind of like, you're meant to sweep these things under the rug. Um, and it's based on embedding reflexive practice for all parts of the work, not just qualitative. How does this relate to agency for participants? It opens the doors up to creative methods because it acknowledges that reality and presenting reality of knowledge is complex. For example, I used multiple methods to interview participants and I shaped the methods around the participants rather than just applying a method to participants and hoping people would fit in. I avoided doing things just because they're the done things. For example, I had increased transparency on my participant information sheets in light of a violent history in autism research. And even though some people are like, that might skew the data, I was like, not enough to justify harming participants. And if you're going to study trauma, you should be so open about the questions that are coming. There were no mandatory questions, the ability to skip them, open fields, describe answers, even though this was described as messy data. Um, and also, I embedded all of participant stories into a coherent framework, not just the tragedy, not just the community, not just the things that were relevant. And people genuinely kind of balked at the idea that I was using everything, but I just wanted to make sure that all of participant stories were told. And the thing is, I wasn't necessarily perfect. Like, I didn't know that participatory science was a thing. I got into community psychology while I was doing my PhD, and if I could go back and do things differently, I 100% would. But these were just little pockets of agency that I could embed into the more positivistic tradition that I was dragged through um, in coming into psychology. Under this method, rigor is about more than replication. It's about ethical study design. It's about ethical data collection, fully informed consent, which psychology does not do enough of. It's about reflexive practice, like reflexive journaling, trying to think about how your own values influence interpretation, for example. It's about ongoing transparency about every aspect of the research, and it's about taking responsibility for quite literally any damage that comes from your research, which is more important than ever in psychology. Yeah, thank you very much.